Good evening. This is the first official lecture of the semester, and really welcome. It's great that you're here. I'm doing the free introduction. It's wonderful that we have both Louisa Lambry and Mark Lee here. Mark will actually introduce Louisa, but just a few things from me. It is great that you're all here and that this is going to be a really fantastic semester. And a lot of people have worked very, very hard from the communications department. Ken Stewart, we have Paige Johnston, who's just recently joined us, who will be responsible for events. And there are a lot of very exciting lectures and events that are going to happen soon. One of the main features that many of you know who've been here at the GSD, but for those of you who are new, is our Rouse Visiting Artist Program. And we're very proud of the Rouse Visiting Artist Program because it actually enables the school to bring a diversity of artists to the school. I think many of us feel very strongly that the dedication to the arts defined more broadly, we, as you know, have a program here which is also defined under the rubric of sensory media, that these kinds of commitments to questions of representation, to the way that we look at things, to the way that we make things, is in a way just as important as the way in which we pay attention to our history and theory program or our technology program. And so it's an area that we are very committed to, and we actually want to even put more resources towards this part of the school. So without going on for too long, it's really great that Louisa is here. On Tuesday of next week, we will also have Thomas Koolhaas, the son of Rem, who will present a documentary called Rem. So I would like you to please try and come to that. That is officially the US premiere of Rem. It's not the same as REM, the band, and it's not the same as the video or the film that Lou Kahn's son made, so I think it would be exciting. And then soon after that, Ivan Ban, another photographer, will be a Rouse visiting artist on September 12th. We will also have James Welling on November 13th and Sylvia Kolbowski on October 24th, amongst others that will be announced as part of the Rouse Visiting Artist Program. Tonight, after Louisa, there will be a conversation with Mark Lee, and Mark, in fact, will introduce Louisa. And as you know, Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston are this year's artistic directors of the Chicago Biennial. They're both graduates of the school, Mark and Sharon, in 1995. And we're very proud of them. Mark, as you again also know, has taught at a number of schools, both in the US and in Europe. And there have been a number of monographs related to their work. In 2014, 2G did a monograph. And then Berkhauser in 2016 did the monograph, which was called A House is 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 a House. So that was done in 2016. I think Mark is obviously very concerned to make sure that we all know that a house is a house. But I think that was a really great publication. They are also in the midst of finishing a number of important projects. The Menil Drawing Institute on the campus of the Menil Collection, which will open in 2017, later on this year, probably. The Contemporary Art Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, which is also another of their projects, and the new UCLA Graduate School Studios campus in Culver City, amongst many, many other things, and of course the wonderful project of being responsible for the Chicago Biennial. Would you please welcome Mark Lee, who will introduce Louisa Lambre. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. I'm delighted to be here. I'm thrilled to introduce Louisa Lambre. Within the context of the GST, I feel obliged to situate Louisa's work within the lineage of art photography that deals with architecture as a subject matter. So not architectural photography that depicts the building or depicts the architecture or represents the architecture, but art photography. And I'm thinking of the dominant movements of the late 20th century. I was thinking of the American New Topographics movement from the 1970s, perhaps, with figures like Louis Baltz, Stephen Shore, Robert Morris, with a very different way, Robert Adams, sorry, with a different way of looking at landscape. That they include the new type of man-made environment, so the industrial parks, the urban sprawl and suburban sprawl, they're all involved with a new way of looking at landscape. The only Europeans within this group were Ben and Hilla Becher, who from Dusseldorf and went to Dusseldorf and became professors there, and somehow took that type of movement. You all know their work very well in that devoted to the 1920s tradition of the German tradition of Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity, with an extreme sense of soberness and somberness. You know, the photographs are all shot on overcast days, minimize the amount of contrast. Everything was very frontal, very direct. The interesting thing was that the movement that spawned from their students from the 70s, the so-called the Dusseldorf School, which also looked at architecture with figures like Andreas Gursky, Thomas Struve, Thomas Roof, Candida Herfer, that in many ways retained that type of documentary tradition, but I think in the 90s or even late 80s begin to take advantage of the new technologies that were developed, new technologies for digital photography as well as for printing, that creates this type of work that are extremely monumental in scale, with an expansive focus on details. Oftentimes you see them in these type of aluminum back frames and plexiglass frames. And in many ways, the object of the photographs themselves, as they were exhibited, oftentimes reflect not only the subject matter of the buildings that they were photographing, but also the institutions of which they are exhibited. Louisa is of a different generation, and in certain ways, I think her interest in architectural work, she's photographed or used as her subject matter many of canonical buildings by canonical architects from Richard Neutra, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, to John Lautner or Schindler, or current architects like Herzog Dameron, Sana, Alvaro Siza. But I would say, in many ways, the similarity to the previous dominant style also stops there. In my view, I think Louisa uses a lot of seriality in her work. There's a certain sense of things that are ethereal or temporary. And also the work are much more fragmentations, like details and fragments of the buildings, you know, as opposed to the earliest schools of work. So, and also many of the works were photographed from the interior, looking out. So there's a sense of the viewer seeing the architecture through this lens into the exterior world. Another thing that is important in the work is that many of the things that were left outside of canonical architecture, or left outside the images of canonical architecture, are brought back in. You know, this type of occupation of things that are typically outside of the image of these buildings, such as landscape, or I could think of Louisa's pictures of Philip Johnson's house for the Menils in Houston, where the condensation, the fog in the glass of the courtyard was incredibly important. Furthermore, I think many tenets of the architecture that she photographs, such as transparency, and somehow turned back into something the opposite of what you expect, like opacity or even reflection, that is important in her work. Louisa is someone whose work I have followed and admired for a long time. Louisa is also a friend. We oftentimes engage in conversations. I would say we don't talk so much about photography. We talk a lot more about art. We talk a lot more about painting. We had great conversations about Lucio Fontana and the whole Concerto Spaziale group and the movement, And so in many ways, I think Louisa's work comes also from that tradition of abstract painting, and it has to do with pictorial space in relationship to physical space. I would also mention something about Louisa's persona. Those who had the fortune to meet her, I think Louisa is incredibly friendly, incredibly affable, a little bit shy even, come across as shy, and a kind of almost a sense of fragility in her persona. But I think behind that, it belies an incredible focus, determination, as well as a desire for precision. I think these two polarities in her persona, to find a reconciliation between these two polarities, it's not a static middle. It's not something that is static as a common denominator, but it's an incredibly active oscillation between these two polarities. And I find this is something that is also present in her work. I remember the architect Valerio Orchati. He was describing the reflecting pool in the Barcelona pavilion. He said that is the most still body of water he has ever seen. Like, it's almost like a sheet of mirror that is completely still. But then when he begins to look through the water, he begins to notice the pebbles in the water, and the pebbles are completely smooth, and the pebbles were formed by being underneath, within a rapid river of the water moving in incredible rapid speed. And he talked about the juxtaposition of understanding something that's completely still, but in your mind you had this sense of motion. And for me, that's an apt description of what I see in Louisa's work. Oftentimes you see the work that seems almost boring, but then at one moment, after deciphering it, something incredibly dynamic begins to appear. And I don't know how much we could see of the work that we will see tonight. Louisa has been involved in her biography. She has been involved in many group shows and many solo shows, as well as the subject of many monographs. She had solo shows at the Hammer Museum in LA, the Menil Collection in Houston, the Carnegie International in Pittsburgh, was exhibited in the New Museum, Guggenheim Museum, Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo, and countless more. But I think one of the thing about her biography that really stuck in my head was that she was born in Como, the region of where the Lombard region of where the master builders came from, and she studied at the St. Elias School, the kindergarten designed by Giuseppe Tarani. I think with that type of pedigree, no matter what vocation she has chosen for herself, I think architecture has to be part of that destiny. So, on that note, please join me to welcome Louisa Lambry.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here. So I will just start by showing you some images, and hopefully things will emerge as I go along. So this is a 16 millimeter film transferred on DVD, made inside the St. Elia Kindergarten and inside the Casa del Fascio in Como. So I filmed the two buildings and then superimposed the footage, and felt very free to play with it. And I kind of flipped it and changed it and colored it in a way which is very pictorial for sure, but in a way that doesn't mean to create any kind of representation of the building. And in fact, it's just a way to really make it my own. So it's a way to play with history, whether they are personal or about architecture or history. So, and both buildings are from by Giuseppe Terragni. They're in Como, which is where I come from, and all of my work is about interior spaces. So I really use architecture as to really depict a sort of a inner world, and so this is never ending. This is supposed to be a loop, and it's silent. There is no sound and no noise, and it really never ends. So, but it really is a sort of a personal history. So I really use architecture to really create my own history and my own world, rather than document it in any kind of way. And so this was made for Venice Biennial in 1999, so quite a long time ago. It was curated by Harald Zeman, and he chose 5 really young, unknown girls to represent the Italian pavilion. And he asked me to look at the place where I came from, at my biography. So it's all about really subjectivity and the way I could feel free to really tell my own story through very specific buildings, of course, because this is so well known. But at the same time, it is also quite invisible and ghostly and almost never really there, so which is exactly what it's supposed to be. And this is a picture of Casa del Fascio in Como. So I just put together some images which make a sort of an overview of my work from 1999 until now. And I looked at them really as an overview, as if they were part of just one series of photographs. So they all relate to each other. This is a house by Richard Neutra in Los Angeles. This is a building by Oscar Niemeyer, the Palacio da Industria in São Paulo. And all the images are really connected. One takes to the next one, and they're all based on the idea of being in the space and really experiencing the space and being there. So I don't feel particularly close to the tradition of architectural photography, but when I looked at it, just to find places that would interest me visually, what I couldn't find was the experience, anything about the experience of buildings, of places. And so I felt I missed that. I really missed that. And so I felt I found myself doing that, taking care of that. So I tried to find places that I like, and I find them in books usually. And then I try to photograph them, and I spend time there. And so while you see images which don't show any number of variations here, for example, this is the Gropius house in Lincoln, the images I put together for this presentation compose a kind of endless series of images which are all connected and they show my approach to them, really how I use them. For example, this is an image of a skylight of the Sheets Goldstein House by Lautner in Los Angeles. And for an exhibition in Los Angeles, I was asked to suggest some places that I would like to photograph. And Lautner has is based on really spectacular buildings. But I found these skylights in the kitchen and in the bathroom, which are places I very often photograph. And so I photographed the skylights of the house. And what you can see here is me looking above through a skylight. The inside and the outside really merge on the same plane of the glass. And every time I work somewhere, I really try to find connections and reasons to be there. So in this case, I was thinking of everything California was about in many ways. For example, the light and space movement and the artists who are part of it, such as Irwin, Larry Bell, and at the same time, all the artists using photography, working in Los Angeles, such as James Welling, Uta Barth, and really artists I looked so much up to. And so my work really is a sort of a homage to all of that through architecture. So I really use architecture to make images as a visual device rather than buildings to look at, to understand, or to represent in some kind of way. So it's so mine is a much more personal, much more subjective, much more private approach. And really the work is about how I experience the buildings. So I often, almost always, work with the subtle, very subtle variations and the series and sequences, because they show time and time, the time that I spent there, and really they show me experiencing the place rather than the place. So rather than architecture photography, I really think that my photographs are a sort of a document, almost of a performance, which is myself being in the space. Really, it's about that experience and through time. And so that's what the photographs really document, much more than the buildings, although the buildings are very much part of it. And when I take pictures of them, I really try to look at details which really speak about the buildings also. So my work really is a kind of combination. It's a sort of a synthesis between myself and the architect's work in this case. This is also part of the series which uses a skylight and looks above. When I install the photographs in the space, I like to really use photography to really create an environment. So I always install them as part of the space so that they can become part of it. There are often empty walls and empty rooms, and really spaces people can walk through the same way I walked through the buildings myself. This is a picture of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. I was asked to take pictures of of the museum for an exhibition there, and so this building was very interesting for me because it's not the kind of building I would usually look at or think about myself, because it's so Baroque and really different and very far from the simple geometrical shapes and abstraction I love so much about modernist houses. So, but this was a building made by a woman, really, and she also felt very free to use space and images together to create her own personal space. So I really identified with her story, and I included it here because you probably know it, so you can relate to it. When I take pictures, I never really show the buildings, so I really focus on small details, and the buildings are either not there or just in the background, but you can perceive them and you kind of have a sense of them anyway. And this is part of the top floor, which is maybe not open to the public, but this is where Isabella had her apartment. And she really created all these compositions very freely, and with elements coming from many different places and cultures, and she really combined them so freely. So I really admired this about her. So that was a bit of a special project because I very rarely accept commissions. I only photograph what I like, which is something I usually can identify with and understand in a very sort of not so much in an intellectual way, but more in an intuitive and emotional way. And so this is more part of my usual path. So this is a house by Campo Baeza in Madrid. This, you cannot see it very well, but it's a house that Mark and Sharon did in Los Angeles, in Pacific Palisades. It's called the Hill House, which is a very beautiful, minimal house with diagonal walls. And again, it brought me back to my interest in the light and space movement and those artists I actually often thought about. So the artists and works of art have informed my work much more than architecture, although I use architecture and spaces for my images. So I moved to Los Angeles for a couple of years in 2011, and all my work in photographing houses started from really kind of needing to find a house in some way. And Los Angeles for me is home because of all the beautiful, beautiful houses, modernist houses there, which are almost too many to be real. And when I moved there, I wasn't feeling so homesick anymore because I was there, and that was already a little bit of a work. So it was easier for me to shift and to really look at the artists that had informed my work with architecture all along. So artists I had a kind of dialogue with. So instead of photographing houses, I started to photograph works of art by artists I had some affinities with. So this is Donald Judd in Marfa. And the way I would photograph these works of art is exactly the same way I had photographed buildings and houses and rooms until then. So I actually really sometimes went inside them. So to do this, I was physically inside this work, which is a large sculpture. When I install the photographs in spaces, I really try to find subtle ways for the photographs to really belong there in a way that it's not necessarily so obvious, but sometimes it happens through coloring, through spacing, height, distances, lights. So this is still Donald Judd. This work is part of an installation by Donald Judd, which is called 100 Variations of this particular type of sculpture. So while I didn't show all the variations that I have of my pictures, there are kind of hundreds of each of them, so they are kind of endless. As I really work in the moment. I never try to create perfect, iconic pictures of any place. So each moment is kind of important, and each moment can become an image. So that's how I related to Donald Judd work in this case, except as well as his interest in minimalism and working with abstraction and space and all the most obvious ways, but his interest in endless variations and that all of them actually matter and can make a space, and you can make it your own. So that's how I connected to his work. You cannot see the picture so well here because it's very bright, but this is a photograph of Lucio Fontana's Ambiente Spaziale. So again, a two-dimensional way of working with space and abstraction. Lucio Fontana used to literally cut his canvases to really to have a sense of what would be behind them, and he made that with his canvases, but also he actually made an actual environment which is to be walked through, which is exactly what I photographed. And again, when I photographed the cut of this environment, which is life-size, and when I installed the photographs in the space, again I try to make an environment with the pictures in a very sort of a minimal, simple way. So this is an exhibition in London where pictures by works of art, pictures of works of art by other artists are together in a space. This is a private gallery in London, and in this, I usually try to adapt myself and the pictures to a space, to create another kind of space. In this case, I asked two architects from Belgium called Office to really continue a kind of work that they started in London at the Barbican Gallery a couple of months earlier, where they created some simple rooms for photography, for an exhibition about photography and space. And they were very simple, beautiful, geometrically shaped spaces. So I asked them to continue that and extend that into this gallery in London. And I asked them to just make a diagonal wall so that you could walk around this wall. This wall would create some rooms which usually are not there. And somehow, because of the photographs shown, you might have a sense of walking inside a picture. So I really wanted to create that kind of experience from the picture to the world. So here there are some photographs of Donald Judd. These are some photographs of Charlotte Posenensche's sculpture. She's a German artist who used to work in the 60s, and she really was working with the seriality. And her work was very... She was so rigorous in her work, so I really love her work, so I photographed it. And through this wall, you would never be able to see very similar pictures at the same time, so you had to kind of create inside yourself like a sort of recollection of them, wondering if you had already seen that picture or not. Never really being able to look at them together. So basically, works of art by artists, I sort of have a kind of dialogue with in the space, and really trying to work with the space in a way that it would really share something with the photographs. So this is the inside of a sculpture by Lygia Clark. It's a bicho. It's a very small sculpture that works like a sort of a small universe, like a space, and you can really play with it and make it your own. So it has endless possibilities. It can become anything. So I really like to play with it. This is again Charlotte Posenenske. So really anything that helps me to articulate and explore more this dialogue between space and abstraction, but always really in very personal and subjective terms. So, and sometimes while walking around these newly created rooms in the gallery, you would have to really walk very closely to the photographs. Usually you are required to keep a certain distance from them, but I really wanted to create a sort of a flow where you would find yourself really close to them. This is a sculpture by Barbara Hepworth in England, and she would create sculpture you would walk through. They were made to be walked through, so it was easy for me to feel like I wanted to photograph them. And again, in this case, you would just have to find yourself very close to them, almost like touching the photographs while you would walk through the space. This is a more recent a photograph of a very sort of a recent building by Soil, the Manetti Shrem Museum in Davis in California. And I had just looked at Sol Lewitt and photographed him, his work. And so for me it was like a natural continuation of that. And really a sort of a way to continue that conversation. This is Breuer, Marcel Breuer. This is the Met Breuer in New York. So all the images I kind of put together, they're not about one particular architect, they're not about one particular series. I really just chose them to show you where they come from and how they are, how they relate to each other, and where I come from really. So how I work, how I approach buildings and images, and what I do with the buildings and how I use them to make images while really respecting them and acknowledging them and feeling very close and connected to them, but still very much making them my own through the pictures. So again, this is one of the very iconic windows of the museum, and I placed these particular photographs in relation to the actual windows in the museum. So that you would be able, in some cases, to really see both of them at the same time. This is also Breuer in Paris. This is the UNESCO building in Paris. So it's a very, very personal look at Breuer's work, and at the same time, it kind of acknowledges Breuer's work, kind of really specifically, certain elements of it for sure. So I don't really mean to ignore his work or not to acknowledge it or not to respect it. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think I do this because I kind of have a sort of understanding of it, and I certainly use it for myself. And this is part of a work I've been doing for the Chicago Biennial for Mark, who's thankfully here, and he will be able to provide a whole other kind of discourse about the images and the buildings, much more than I could ever do. So this is the Farnsworth House in Plano. So all of them really show a much more experiential approach to the building. Maybe some I certainly work with light and with time and with geometry. And sometimes there are some actions which I do take, for example, opening the windows or closing a curtain, or just really small gestures which are the ones that people usually do in the houses where they live. So really sort of everyday small gestures, but they are the ones that make you feel like you're actually really living there, that that place is your place. So really is a way to make these places my own. And since all my work is somehow loosely based on the idea of the grid and what I can do with it and how I can play with it, so the images of the Farnsworth House will be shown with images of Crown Hall in Chicago, and I photographed it really thinking about Mondrian and the grid, also very much about what Mark and Sharon did at the MCA in Chicago, which was a beautiful, immersive installation based on the grid. So really every time is a way to acknowledge where I am and many kind of histories, and trying to really make a synthesis of all of that in the photographs, which are very simple, very, very simple and minimal, really are made of all of these connections, much more than the actual architecture. And I should say that these photographs all of them are really quite made digitally, meaning that I use film. I use film when I photograph, and a medium format camera. But then I really spend time with a technician at the lab, and really we completely remake. I would say we really remake all the places, all the images, and there's quite a big difference between what you see and what the actual shot was. So it's not about having better photographs. It's really about changing them in a way that really reflect myself more. So so they're really, what you see is really not very truthful at all. And it's all done in a very subtle way, and it's not meant to be seen or to be known, really. But this is a very sort of a personal archive, which doesn't really reflect the actual places. And this is a photograph where you just see some pieces of furniture at the side, towards the edge of the image. So there are some hints that can lead you to really recognize the places, but that's not the point. But this is also really a picture of the Farnsworth House, as well as addressing really my personal approach and history to images of architecture. And that's it. Yes.
So I think I'll start with asking Luisa a few questions, and then we'll open up the floor, to some more questions on the floor. I think, well, first of all, thank you for incredible presentation. I understand, I think Luisa, for her entire career, has only given 4 public lectures. So I think it's fantastic that we have it at with the GSD community. I'd like to ask you about your beginnings and your ends. How do you begin? What are the criteria for you for a selection of a building, all your buildings has a pedigree, huh? At the same time, oftentimes at the end product, the depiction of the building is not important. The source of the building is not important for the viewer. They're always untitled. They're never, the name of the building are never revealed. But at the same time, it's important for you.
Yes. Does it work?
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, it's true. All the photographs are untitled. However, there's a parenthesis that follows with the name of the building or the name of the work of art which I photographed, and but never the name of the artist or never the name of the architects. And so I really acknowledged where all of that comes from. I just really make it my own. So it is as if this place or this work had another author, really. So it's about authorship. So I really, I become the author somehow. So I really feel that I can take all of that and work with it without feeling too bad about it, because it really comes from a sincere appreciation and love, really. So I really like all of this, and I feel that's where I feel most at home. And these are things that I know, and I really feel quite comfortable there. So it's not so difficult to do it.
Sometimes for the cognoscenti, one could recognize, like we can recognize Breuer's window. Campo Baeza, almost not.
Yes.
The Caesar, yes, you can. So you also didn't try too hard to efface the source of the building.
Yes. Sometimes the details that I look at are really quite iconic. Sometimes not so much, but I feel that they're really quite meaningful, and they really make the picture. So, and they really tell about the building or that architect's work. So I don't feel that I am being kind of disrespectful in some way, or that I don't feel that this is too random. This is made randomly. I really kind of look at specific information which might be telling, not so obviously, and they might not tell so much or what you expect, but they speak about a history or the building or someone's work nevertheless. So yeah.
Well, I also like to ask you about the end, how your pieces are exhibited. And as an artifact, as a photograph itself, what it does to the space and what else that could come out of it. You have mentioned before about your involvement in the Venice Biennial, Architecture Meets People, that was curated by Sana.
Yes.
And Sejima Nishizawa has selected your photographs of different sources, but that invokes a certain atmospheric of their own work.
Yes.
So whether it's the sources from Nehemiah or from Mies, is in a way important. In a way, I thought it was interesting to me because the images came from architecture, but the images themselves could become the source of a generation of another architecture.
Yes, that was so easy and natural. So they basically did what I do. Mm-hmm. So they actually selected the photographs themselves, and they selected works of mine which would remind them, with which they would identify with. Mm-hmm. Completely. So with which would remind them of their own work. So again, a very simple way of kind of being in the world and really choosing things that you feel close to, because they speak to you and they speak about yourself. So using buildings and architecture in that way, really as a reflection of yourself. So they did just that, which was a beautiful, which made a beautiful dialogue, I thought, because that's exactly what I do with my work, always.
And you're very specific about how your pieces are exhibited. You shared with us the space in Thomas Dane that you work with Kirsten and David.
Yes, yes,
Can
yes,
you
yes.
talk a bit about your relationship between your spaces, the pieces, and the spaces where they're exhibited? Like, for instance, the Lautner pieces. You know, when you show them in seriality, but then the spacing is not equal.
Yes.
What are you trying to do? How do you relate to spaces? If you can share some examples.
I think of images as spaces. So for an image to be in a space, I feel it's a chance to create a conversation and a dialogue between spaces, many different kind of spaces, which are more physical and metaphysical, and above all, there are spaces you can be part of. So there are spaces that might be contemplative, but most of all, there are spaces you can move around and walk around. So really, you can be part of them, which is really sort of a key in my case. So every time when I install, I really try for the photographs to be part of the space, like they had always been there. And it might just be one picture on a long wall, or it's not about filling the space. Quite the opposite. There's a lot of spare space and spare room and emptiness, which can just create a dialogue with the images. And most of all, is a space that you can feel yourself, mentally or in some kind of way, or physically, a place you can find yourself in. So yeah, it's a space for yourself.
Well, which now I think I have to ask a kind of Hans Ulrich type of question. Who are your heroes? Who are your forefathers? Because architecture is you use architecture for something else, but you also talk a lot about artists like Agnes Martin or George O'Keeffe.
Yes.
A lot of them are female artists that deals with seriality or the subject matter of some of the artwork of Lydia Clark and Charlotte Posanesky.
Yes.
Can you talk about your influences?
So I look at architecture and architecture photography to really to find images. I find all of this in books. So that's architecture and space exist as an image for me. But I really don't. Otherwise, I don't really look at it. I don't think of architecture. It's not something I'm obsessed with. I'm obsessed with houses or works of art, but I don't really understand architecture. Otherwise, I don't have that kind of understanding or knowledge. I use it though. I really look at it and use it. But what I've been informed by has certainly be the work by female artists. Questions of identity and self-representation, and through photography or through paintings. Yeah, a sort of a female experience, which I feel closer to, much more than architecture photography, for example, for which I do have a lot of respect for, and I can certainly relate to in many ways. But I feel that's not where I come from. So I really think of the work of Agnes Martin and Vija Selmins, or I wrote my thesis on Cindy Sherman. So really, sort of questions around female identity and female experience, which in my case emerges through spaces. And I feel that my photographs are kind of self-portraits, much more than portraits of the architecture.
I mean, we never talked about this, but this issue of self-portrait or
Yes.
portrait or Cindy Sherman, I guess I never thought of your work that way because oftentimes when you incorporate landscape or things that were abject or outside of what one expects, you know, and I think about Turner's paintings when the debris were in the foreground, but you almost made that kind of debris into the center of the space. Oftentimes, the tree, the photographs that was outside that the architectural photographer wants to avoid, you somehow make it the center of your piece.
Yes. Well, there's actually a center in the photographs always. There's a system. There's a system around which the photographs are built.
Yeah.
It's not so obvious, but it's always there. And it's made so that you sort of you build on it and then you forget about it because it's done sort of so precisely that you can just perceive the mood or the atmosphere, but there's a sort of a strong structure behind, always. And so, yeah, all the photographs usually are based on symmetry or have a center, and it's really my center.
Yeah.
So I really sort of, when I take pictures, I sort of align myself with the building in some way, and I try to figure out the building's system, and we kind of find each other. We study each other, and it's really about how I relate to this place.
Wally Beshti, the artist and academic, had suggested that your work is more about a screen than the frame. Is that fair? I mean, if the center is important, is the center more important to hold the picture together versus how you crop it or the edges?
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's my images can be looked at very, very fast. There's really nothing to hold on to too much. No particular detail. They're not telling that way. So they're really, you could tell that there are like screens and they really work like objects in the space, and the spaces themselves, or they're quite sculptural. So yeah, but they're not images to look at or study or to find any kind of revealing piece of information about whatever place that is.
Great. I feel like we're talking in our living room, except that
Yeah.
I don't have Mies van der Rohe chairs and I don't have a
Yeah.
microphone. But perhaps we can take some questions from the audience for Louisa. Speak to the mic, please.
It seemed like you went to, great lengths to have these like very abstract photos, but it's not simply in like the scale of the photo, but also in like the tremendous amount of white space, which is like usually a result of like glare. And I'm just kind of curious, like why you chose to include like, I suppose, just glare and like this extremely like washed out effect in, which was a kind of a continuous thing in all your photographs.
So they're not as bright as you might think after looking at this. So a lot of details and information were lost in this projection. So there's actually more in the photographs probably, but I do overexpose a lot, or as I underexpose, for example. I really try not to work with physical or material qualities of the places. I really try to connect or use most immaterial or metaphysical aspects of the buildings because it's just easier for me to do. So it's, and light, even in its excess, really helps you do that very much, because a lot gets lost and a lot can be transformed, and so you can really change quite a bit of whatever is in front of you. So yeah, it's more of a metaphysical way of looking. So yes.
Hi. I want to ask you about your comment just now when you said you don't think you understand architecture in the same way as other architects. What part of architecture do you think architects are thinking about that you're not thinking about?
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk to architects, because they help me think, or they help me see things that I would never see or think about, because not only because I don't come from that background, but because I don't have that kind of sensitivity. So for me, it's always so interesting to listen to architects speaking, because I learn so much and I think differently. But I would say that also, yes, I'm more of an artist, so I feel very free. Maybe too free to look at architecture, but I certainly do. So, but sometimes I'm very lucky and I can find architects who are interested in what I do. And because they understand it, or they see something they also hadn't thought about before, maybe. But many architects I kind of encountered are not interested at all in what I do, because they don't see themselves enough. So they need something completely different. So I feel I'm not the image maker for them, because I'm not able to do that kind of more documentary work they might need, very understandably. But also, when I started to take photographs, I was in Los Angeles as an artist in residence at the Max Center around 2001, and I really wanted to meet Julius Schulman to look at his archive, because very often I find my images in other images. So I went to him, and very, very respectfully, and very, like, as a fan, really. And to introduce myself, I showed him a couple of pictures that I had taken, and he hated them. He really, really hated them. So he really actually trashed them. But it was a little bit mortifying, but it was also really validating, because I knew that that's not what I was doing. So it was a good. Also, he tried to teach me about how to take proper pictures. So it was very, very interesting. But it was very also liberating, because I knew that that was not me. So I didn't want to do that. So it was good.
Also, Julius hated any picture that's not taken by himself. Right?
Yeah.
I have a stupid question. Do you do any After Effects on your pictures? And if yes, what are those?
So I do. I would say that 90% of the work is done after I take pictures. So a lot, most of it. So mine is really not a reflection of reality. They're completely made, sometimes to larger extent, sometimes not so much, but always. Sometimes I I remake a space or a room. I add pieces. I take pieces away. I completely change colors. I very often take color away, and there's a lot of desaturation involved, and there's a lot of changes. I really sometimes I only use small pieces of photographs and work on those. So really try to I have some very clear images of what it is that I want to do, even when I am taking pictures, only that I know that when I'm taking pictures, my pictures are not there. So they're not in front of me. So I make them afterwards.
So I'm wondering, you find these images in the architectural photography in the books, but then how long does it take you when you're in the architecture itself to kind of place yourself and find the image in real life?
Usually, I kind of know what I'm going to do. I go to some place with clear intentions. I go there for some reasons, but it's often the case that I find something unexpected, or that what I had in mind is not there. And sometimes I spend days and days and days. What you saw here is really just a sort of a small overview, just to show you an approach and just to show you sort of an attitude towards images. But of each image, there are hundreds and hundreds of variations and possibilities. And all of them are equal, really. So all of them have a reason to exist. And when I choose them, it's not about the best picture at all. There is no best pictures. I feel that every moment and every image has the same worth, really. So it's not about any particularly perfect or iconic picture. It's just about a moment reflected in the pictures.
Thank you so much for the beautiful presentation and discussion. I've been completely captivated. I was thinking as you were showing images, some of them look familiar. As an architect, we can pick out certain details and we start to piece it together, and I felt a bit like a detective looking at the work, and I was really sort of focusing on the details, and I thought you were kind of creating a kind of a tension, something that I might have overlooked. You had sort of seen differently and called our attention to it. And then I was thinking about architecture and photography, and I've really enjoyed this dialogue because each is so invested in its own discourse and can articulate through its own discourse what it's doing. So that's been fantastic. I was thinking about Benjamin and the work of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility, and how he talks about a kind of emerging medium on its own terms, not like painting, but as photography. And then he has offering some clues about architecture, and he says architecture is experienced in a state of distraction, unlike some of these other works. And I was struck by that because in your exhibitions, you're creating a kind of space for attention by situating them in space with the white space, creating attention, which is what I felt today, looking at your work differently, seeing pieces that were familiar, somehow defamiliarized, and noticing things I never noticed before. So I thought that was really amazing. I guess I was thinking about attention and distraction, which is what Benjamin's interested in as an observer of contemporary life. Since then, fast forward to our time, almost a century later, and the kind of economies of attention and distraction. You talk about saturation, I think of commercial imagery, and I notice how my daughter is drawn to images, usually very deliberately saturated images. And I think about your work in the context of a contemporary kind of deluge of images and the kind of resistance towards the kind of consumer image or the kind of saturated image. Could you talk a little bit about how your images occupy a kind of ecology of images, if we were to say we live in a world, sort of inundated by images, all clamoring for our attention. How do you create attention within a field of distraction like what we might experience on a daily basis?
I like not to create attention, so I really like for the world to be as invisible, as silent, and as quiet as possible. So that's more that's more about I feel about them. I also like images to work in a way that you actually have to pay attention to them, to sort of look at them and understand them a little bit, and to really look at whatever subtleties or differences might be there. So that asks you to kind of slow down and to really be more introspective. So it's a bit of a different, very different world and a very different attitude. So if they have a place in the world, this I don't know, but they certainly speak for myself and my place in the world, for sure. So I think they really, making this kind of images really helped me find my way through the world in a way. But as images, I like that they don't scream more. So I like that they're not in your face, or I like that they're kind of quiet. So I think there's space for that as well.
I think that's a great question, Eric's question. I feel, well, Louisa, I would say, is one of the few people I know that has distraction deficit disorder. So it's no problem. He's so focused. But I think Eric's question makes me think about this quote of Jeff Koons, who said, in every single one of his work, you need something from the work that draws people into the room, and then it needs a second aspect of the work to make them stay 5 minutes. And in a way, you intentionally eschew the part that draws them in. But I feel that maybe this type of, I don't want to say laconic, but this type of attitude that you don't care to draw them in, that you want voluntary beholders, actually it's kind of interesting. When the world is moving very fast around you, and you deliberately move a little bit slower. And I think that's one of the experience I have of your work. Even when I didn't know that you're in the show, there's something about your work that doesn't make you stop, but makes you do a double take. And sometimes people will go back. I think that moment is kind of important. And hearing your thoughts about your own cadence and your own pace, and because once they are there, they will stay.
Yeah. It's not that I don't care or I don't look for that. Mm-hmm. I think it can happen in different ways, and I think people find what they need to find, kind of. So if they find that, that's there. So it's not that I take it away at all. It's just another kind of experience, which is definitely more quiet.
Hi. I'm actually a little bit surprised that you would receive some comments from architects that would be don't really react very well to your work, because I feel like you talk a lot about experience, and I think architects also talk a lot about experience and sort of documenting that. And so I was wondering if you ever thought about that your images could then become a reality, because you talk about okay, you go through all these processes after, right? And so it's sort of not really a reality anymore, but it's your own little world. So I guess I'm wondering if you could see yourself as a sort of architect with photography as your design process, and because you're effectively designing your own little world with these series of images, right?
Yeah. I don't feel like an architect, but I think I'm sensitive to spaces, and I like to look at them and create them in many ways, in the pictures and also with the installations. but I wouldn't call myself an architect. But yeah, I make images. But yeah.
Perhaps we can, if there's a last question.
I think, oh, that seems really hot. So as architects, we spend so much time trying to represent space by having scale figures put into drawings and basically trying to bring in a human element to a vision. So I'm curious about the absence of humans in your work. I wondered if you could explain kind of the loneliness and solitude that's in the pieces.
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I think when an image is empty or when a space is empty, it's easier for you to project yourself there. So it's much easier to do that than when the space is crowded already. So yeah, there is a need for emptiness and silence, but also I think an empty space is there for you to be there. So it has a lot of potential in that sense.
I think to end it like a talk show, I have to mention your next venue would be at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. It opens in 2 weeks, September 16th, less than 2-hour flight away from Logan Airport. So thanks again, Louisa. Great work. Thank you.